I am here at Bridgeway Capital Management in a wonderful retreat in 2019 with Shannon Sedgwick-Davis, the author of To Stop a Warlord. And we are working with the team today on generative teaming. So Shannon's going to help us walk through how some of this played out in the mission. But before we do that, for some of our folks that are going to be watching this, they may not know the beginning story of this, and I know it's a long beginning story, but I've asked Shannon to just give us kind of the capsule about how this all got started.
Yes, so I have the extraordinary privilege of helping to run the foundation side of Bridgeway Capital Management's work and mission. And our mission, in part, is a world without genocide or mass atrocity. And so the book is a story about trying to pursue that mission and coming up against many roadblocks and essentially trying to do something that felt very impossible at the time.
Excellent. Great. Well, perhaps if we could just start with the pairings, the generative partners that you began to have in this work. And as I read through it, I made notes all through about Lauren and Eben and David and John and others. And let me just let you go from there.
Yes, no, it's pretty incredible, right? Because it did for us at least start with quite a few pairings. Initially, with John and myself, there was a deep trust that was hard won over several years. That was sort of the precipitating event, if you will, to an ability to do something this out of the box and something that felt very risky. John and I were, fast friends and had an instant connection because I think the things that make my heart beat fast tend to also make his heart beat fast in a very specific way, which is quite unusual. And parts of the world that we love, we seem to share a lot of that. And so we were very, very close. And there were a few times early in our early relationship where we weren't able to communicate through something, which was crazy because it just felt like we were always able to communicate through things. And I think it took us both by so much shock that we literally flew out to Washington, D.C. together to meet with a counselor, a woman who we both trusted to sort of help us walk through that. And still in reflecting on that in the first year and a half of my time here, I'm so grateful for that because I think that took away sort of that last barrier of trust. So I think a lot of times when you get to know someone, things go excellent in the beginning and you don't sense a lot of tension. And then when a moment arises, especially if there's tension over something that feels like it touches your values, or your personal values, potentially, and you're not hearing each other well on that, then you can really sort of swing hard the other way in terms of trust. And we needed that experience. And I think it wasn't by accident that we were able to have that experience a few years before I essentially approached him about doing something pretty crazy. And I think the trust helped pave the way for our ability to do that together. And John was just phenomenal through the process. I think we never talked for long periods of time, but John's someone that you hear from right when you need to hear from them. Like it is radical and insane how it happens. And it's not at times you would expect, right? If I told John, hey, we're going on an important mission, one of these particular warlords in the book, we've got an important mission and it's at 2 o'clock tomorrow, just so you know, 2 o'clock at Central Africa Republic time, that's what we're going to be doing. So you would think that the time you hear from John or that one of us would check in would be like at 1:30 or like at 3 o'clock, how's it going? And it's never the case with John. I might have told him that 2 weeks earlier and I'll hear from him like, not even within a 24-hour window of it with just incredible wisdom about what we're facing. So it's so clear that that when you do share something as a team, the empathy that extends to each other, I think, almost allows for you to be tied in to when others might need encouragement. But it also allows you an ability to be tied in as to when others might need wisdom. And there was so much wisdom that I was able to gain from that relationship. So that's one example. You mentioned, I'd love to touch on Laren and David Ochidi as well. You mentioned Laren, who that came about very differently, right? So in this particular situation, I took a job at Bridgeway, and that job necessitated working with John as chairperson of the board of the foundation that I was asked to help run. And then what happened as a result of our work and this idea of following sort of what most people I think would call an impossible dream of no longer having genocide on the globe, eradicating mass atrocity. What happened along the way is it became obvious that was absolutely not something you could do alone. And I came across this gentleman, Laren Poole, who actually had been one of the original founders of a group called Invisible Children, that had actually told the story of the LRA, which was one of the mass atrocities that we were trying to combat. We had a heavy slate at the time. We were giving smaller grants across multiple geographies and lots of grants. We weren't very laser focused on one particular issue. And it's very sad that we were across multiple conflicts, and that's because there are multiple conflicts on the globe. And so at the time, the LRA was only a small portion of what we were doing, but Laren and the other founders of Invisible Children sort of really introduced us to this idea. And so I spent time traveling and seeing their work on the ground because we granted to them, and was instantly connected to Laren in particular because his creative mind was a really good match for my legal trained mind. I see boundaries. I see beyond the boundaries, but I see the boundaries, and then I'm always thinking, okay, how do I get across those boundaries and do it in a way with like the least amount of explosion as possible? Laren just sees like we're going right here, right? And the explosion can be everywhere, and it's great because you need both of that, right? If you're going to do something so audacious as trying to stop a war, and this at the time was Africa's longest running war, and had been running for 26 years. I mean, if you're going to try to do something that audacious, you need both types of thought. And so Laren and I actually became that partner before he came to work for Bridgeway. So I think that's an interesting sort of mental model that you'd really have to shift away from, because we were capable of having partnerships with just this wealth of people that are so diverse and different than us. And in this case, Laren worked for another organization. And so we had to have some ground rules around that relationship in particular, because we were sharing a lot of confidential information with Laren that we didn't want shared through Invisible Children channels or advocacy channels. And so, again, it was based on trust. And we both relied on that trust to create this partnership that at the end of the day we were able to really move forward with. And the last one I'll briefly touch on, I think as you start to get down the road in these relationships, and as you go sort of from these generative partnerships to, as you said, generative teams and others, if you're really moving towards something that's seemingly impossible, and if you have this goal, you start to get really good at helping each other identify your deficits and where you're in short supply. And it became obvious really quick as we started to have some successes, and we were able to convince a bunch of soldiers in Central Africa Republic to walk out and surrender. And some of them had been kidnapped at the age of 9 or 11 and taken away from their families, and it's now 20 years later, and they're 31 years old, and their families think they're dead, and the idea of sort of helping them get back home and reintegrate, that wasn't going to be John's job, that wasn't going to be my job, that wasn't going to be Laren's job. We were not the appropriate people for that role. And what was so fun with Laren and even with John's wisdom was to go try to find the perfect partner for that activity that we knew we needed to be responsible for. And that was a man named David Ochidi, who was kidnapped at 16 by the LRA. They came into his village in Pavo. They put a gun to him and asked him who he loved the most, his mother or his father. He refused to answer initially. He said, "How can one answer that question? You love them the same." And they forced him to answer the question, and then shot his father upon his response in front of him, and separated him from his brother. And to this day, he still shows up when we hear of returnees because he helps to reintegrate them. He still hopes that his brother will be one of the ones he sees. He's not seen his brother since then. But he was luckily able to escape after some weeks in captivity. And he's been an extraordinary partner. And you know what happens, like when you get into these partnerships at this level that you were talking about, you mentioned something about that it leads to reverence sometimes. It absolutely does. So every person that I just mentioned today, a revere is just even a shallow word, I think, for how much respect and admiration I have for them. And the so exciting thing about reverence is it leads to, I think, humility, and it leads to gratitude. And I think both of those things make the impossible just more possible, because egos go away, right? If you're revering the people that you're shoulder to shoulder with out there, there's no room for ego because you're revering them, so you actually become so much smaller. Like your humility is so great in the wake of someone like John or someone like Laren, or especially someone like David Ochidi. And so you become so small, and so the egos are gone. And it is unbelievable what you can do when you don't have ego in the way, right? It's unbelievable. And you're all focused on the North Star. There's just the union of the relationship, the common thread, and possibly the only common thread is the North Star, which for us was an end to the LRA's violence. And anyway, it just allows you this opportunity to take much deeper risks and to take it arm in arm. And the gratitude is the oxygen for the effort, right? Like that, or that is what it is for me at least. Because it's exhausting. You're in the middle of, in our case, we're in the middle of Central African jungles, people dropping like flies with malaria. It's like 113 degrees on a good day, and there's no shade. It's just a nightmare in some sense. But the gratitude that you feel for those that are sort of out there in the thick of it with you just gives you oxygen. It's what, at least for me, it's what propelled the hard part of the work.
Wow, that is a lot, and that is amazing. One of the pieces that I wanted to ask you about that I read through in the book several places, in the literature of the people that study this whole idea of generative field that's created for something that is the magnitude and just the enormity of a mission like this, that once people are in sync, all manner of resources start coming your way that you had no idea were out there or no way that you had planned for. And sometimes when you're up against the wall and think that everything is going to fall off, it comes. And so I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yes, and it's really hard to talk about that because it is what you're describing. There's no, I can't give you a logical reason that these things happened, but you'll see through the book over and over and over they happened. I remember we would do partner meetings. This is well before the book came out, right? And I would come talk at the partner meetings, and I would tell y'all something, and I would think to myself as y'all were looking back at me, there's no way they believe this actually happened. Like, there's no way they believe that, like, we were talking about helicopters and all of a sudden I just went to Chicago and met with John McCain and 3 other senators to ask for helicopters, because I don't believe that actually happened, even though I know I was just sitting down in Chicago having those meetings. And so, but I mean, that was the constant theme of this book almost. Just you can't get through a chapter without there being something like that arises. And it's sort of just the collective fight in our case, the collective spirit, the collective soul, just opened up collateral doors. It's very spiritual for me. I mean, for me, it feels very, very spiritual, because it's just so often that you're in the midst of that, and it's so much bigger than you, that you can't apply your brain to it. So you just have to sit there and just sort of bask in the sunlight of it. I mean, there's no other way to say it. No, it's extraordinary. So yes, we need helicopters. Somehow, someone happened to be transiting a few through to Tanzania, and they happened to stop here for fuel. And I can get on the phone with the owner and ask him if we can, like, lease them for a week, so that we have 2 extra helicopters, so that we're able to pick up all the 125 kids instead of trying to do racetracks and putting everyone's safety at risk or something with a single helicopter. I mean, that doesn't happen. The discussions that we had, the folks that came sort of into play, the safety, the protection that was around the mission is also something that's really uncanny for the kind of mission that we were engaged in. I mean, it was a military intervention again, and the fact that none of the special operations group that had trained died from enemy fire. There were a couple of difficult situations. The fact that a snake fell out of a tree right in front of Laren, one of the most poisonous snakes in all of Africa, and it caped at him. I mean, that's just while he was sitting in a chair, and he stayed still. I mean, there was just so much of those kind of things that happened over and over, and we were really, really fortunate. It's interesting, though, I think a tiny bit of it, if you try to be cerebral, because I'm in a room full of, or largely full of very cerebral folks. I know my IMT friends are listening. I do think that if you think about it, if people truly go all in on something, right? If they go all in on the North Star, and they're standing side by side, and now this is the person that you're willing to, like, walk into a war zone with. So that means you trust them implicitly. I do think then that as the impossible, or as barriers start to happen, people are more sacrificial in giving everything they can to overcome the barriers too. And so then that just, like, they're willing to kind of throw their own Hail Marys to overcome the barriers. So, I met so-and-so 4 years ago. Let me actually try to make a phone call, which they wouldn't even think to do, or something like that. Because for everyone, the stakes are so high. And sometimes you want to win, now less for winning, but out of just this extraordinary love and, again, reverence for those who are giving so much, on the team as well towards that end. And I think that pushes you in really unique ways.
Wonderful. There's one scene that you describe in the book that I want to refer to and get you to talk to us a little bit about. And it relates to this whole idea of the future. When we get into these generative relationships, that the connection is so strong, the future can emerge through trust. And the scene that I'm talking about is when you gave the graduation address to the SOG and the dancing that happened afterwards, and yet they were going in to risk their lives at that moment. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
So we did something very unconventional for a philanthropic organization after just coming across a lot of difficulty in terms of being able to impact mass atrocities, which again was our mission. with traditional type grants, we made a decision to try to fill a couple of gaps with regards to this particular mission, which was against, again, the LRA, which was responsible for Africa's longest running war. And so as a result, we decided to try some pretty out-of-the-box things that included communication systems as early warning networks in remote villages, and then ultimately training for the African Union forces that were actually pursuing the perpetrators. That was something we couldn't find a blueprint for, and to our knowledge has not ever been done philanthropically, so was very, very, very risky. And so that's what you're referring to. At the end of months of training, I was out for the graduation ceremony of these particular African Union troops, which was incredible. It was incredible to see them get their diplomas, to get their distinction now that they were trained as Special Operations Forces. They were trained very specifically in how to save children when these particular perpetrators would usually surround themselves with children. So during clashes, the children who had been kidnapped were often the first casualties. And they were trained on how to pursue the LRA, which was a group that was broken into small stick units and very difficult to pursue. And so it was very much of a celebration. These men had sacrificed so much already, and they got their awards. And I had started wearing. There's the Saint of the Impossible. There's a Catholic saint, and it's Saint Jude, Saint of the Impossible. And so I started wearing this token just to remind myself that we were out to do something impossible and to serve as an encouragement, and I'd worn it on a bracelet. And so sure enough, the graduation happens, and the guys just let loose. These super serious special operations type guys are just letting loose and dancing, and oh my goodness, Africans dance so much better than us and sing so much better than us. So it was like super embarrassing because they're like trying to get me to participate, which just definitely is not to their level at all. But I did, and as we're dancing and we're like shouting, my bracelet burst, and St. Jude went flying, and some beads that were on my bracelet went flying, and the leader of the special operations group, it landed right next to his foot, and so he picked it up and brought it to me, and he said basically, we've got this, like, we've got this. And anyway, it was just a very meaningful moment for us. I later went back and brought a bunch more of those pennants for them to have as well.
Thank you. One last question, and it really comes from the article that you wrote in August about lessons that you had learned from this mission and doing it. And it's available that we can provide online. But one of the pieces that you started with, and it really links to our topic today on generative listening, is that your advice was, if you're going to go do something like this, to start by listening, and listening at a very different kind of level. So if we can just end with that, if you can give us some tips on that.
Yeah, and I'm so deeply grateful for you guys. I miss Anne. You and Anne really taught me so many tactics for listening, because, by the way, sort of I get into warrior mode, and I'm not always the very best listener by any means. Ask my parents and sometimes my children. In law school, I noticed my first semester of law school, I thought that I was doing really well, and then we would do these practice court sessions. And I was getting dinged hard on the practice court sessions, and I always was thinking, well, I sure think I sounded articulate when I was doing my practice court professor would always tell me afterward, he'd shake his head, and he'd be like, nope, that's your grade. And I'd be like, what is happening here? Like, it's so obvious. And he finally, one day I went to see him after class, and I was like, I'm struggling in this class, and I don't feel like I'm struggling, so I need help understanding that. And it was such a humbling moment. He said, Shannon, the best lawyers aren't the ones who are constantly selling their side of the story. They're the ones that are listening, because when you listen, you're going to hear the flaws potentially or the wins in the other person's argument. And that's going to be able to help you get to your end goal. And you guys have done that. You have come here and taught us that now over years. And I'm so, so grateful for that. So yes, listening's been everything. There's been the idea that we go to another person's country, another person's culture, and presume for 1 second to have any solutions is absurdity, right? And just apply it to yourselves, right? Like just think about your neighborhood or your friend group or your children, right? Think about, let's take it to the children level, right? Think about someone coming to you and presuming to tell you, because one of your children might have had a meltdown in the grocery store or something, someone literally coming up to you and presuming to tell you how you should parent your kids or something that you've known since you've birthed them. So this idea that we would ever go over to another country and presume to have any solutions, right? Of course they have all these solutions. These mamas love their kids just as much as I love my kids. They're hiding their kids under leaves at night to protect them because their kids are going to be kidnapped. You don't think that they've been thinking since 26 years ago, when this already started, of the very best solutions to keep them and their communities safe? Of course they have. So the entire thing was all their idea. It was literally all their idea. And we had just this enormous privilege to bring a little bit of some things that we did have, some money, sometimes some influence, some string pulling in DC and other places. And so we just had this ability to bring a few of those things to augment the solutions that they already had fully baked. And that is the only reason this happened. And so it required a tremendous amount of listening. And listening can only happen in a deep way through presence. And so it costs you a lot. Like, you can't just pop in for a 7-day trip and pop out and then 6 months later be like, here I am with your helicopters, or here I am with this. You know, it requires deep, deep presence. And I have such gratitude for Laren. I mean, Laren moved his entire family out there to live out there. We spent months and months out of our years out there. And until you're fully present, you don't gain trust. And you have to have trust before it's even worth listening, because people aren't going to actually be honest with you and tell you sort of the depths of their ideas or what they think until they trust you.